Brilliant, Caroline. Thank you very much for giving some time to the Mint to talk about your new book, Uneasy Streets.
Thank you. It's nice to be on. Thank you.
Great. Well, um, clearly your book starts saying the incident that led you to take an at the beginning of this book was actually the real thing that got you thinking about China, or were there other things? Because I know you've been also looking at the Belt and Road Initiative. So was that before you actually had your neighbour incident?
No, I think they sort of came together. I think I've been prodding around in China for some time while not being a China scholar. I sort of feel, as a sociologist or geographer or whatever I am, you can't understand the modern world unless you do some reckoning with China. China is really important in lots of ways. And I suppose over the years, because I've made several trips, I used to do research with Londoners living in Beijing and Beijingers living in London. I'd begun to realize that there were much bigger issues than migration at stake, and that China really does, have an impressive infrastructure when it comes to organizing the world in which we live. And I suppose I just gradually uncovered more and more of that. I suppose the things I uncover in the book were sort of hidden. I mean, I didn't know about I knew about the Chinese restaurant in my neighborhood. I didn't know about the other things. So those things were sort of surprising. And so, yes, that's, I suppose, led me to think more and more, what are we got hints during the golden era when, Johnson and co were visiting China and Xi Jinping came over to the UK, that there were a lot of projects somehow in British cities, but I'd never really taken much interest in them. They seemed to me much like other projects, whether they were investors from the Kuwait Sovereign Wealth Fund or UK investments. It seemed to me that they produced the same kinds of buildings and so on and so forth. And then I began to realize that actually wasn't true, that China operates under particular conditions. And that didn't become clear to me until the golden era was over. And you get this sense that we're living in the debris of former times. And you begin to wonder, well, what does that look like? And is the all-powerful empire actually rather ramshackle? And so that idea led me on to try and think a bit more closely about these things.
And it's interesting you say find things that are hidden. And I'm sort of always been interested by your research methodology because I'm sort of used to a bit having to cope with the standard economics approach of find a great big database and see if you can get a line that fits or something like that.
Sure.
And if that's one end of social science, you seem to be maybe at the other end of social science because I suppose you think qualitative response, you try for representative samples and talk to all this sort of stuff. Whereas you seem to, just go out and see who you find.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was social science. I always think of it as kind of, rather ramshackle, rather speculative, rather, let's see if I can find an interesting little detail and see what it links up to and what it means. So I would not in any way claim to be a sort of rigorous social scientist, but I do operate in that the unexpected, the maybe hidden in plain sight is a better way of saying it, because these things are always there. It's just that we don't notice them, or we don't notice them until something happens, perhaps, and then you sort of follow the trail and think, well, what does that lead to? And what does that mean?
But I
So
think, I mean, it seems particularly interesting given, the increasing dominance of AI, etc., that goes and analyzes, meant to have all this knowledge. But of course, you're almost looking for knowledge that isn't written down, that
yes,
people only want to talk about under a non-anonymity generally.
yes.
Um, and they're sort of secrets almost about how the real world might actually work, which, you can't find unless you go and talk to people.
Yes, yes, I think that's I was a very good characterization of what I do. It's not the obvious, it's the kind of, well, I always think, we approach China from a really top-down geopolitical, economic, and those are really good ways to approach it. But it occurred to me that there were other more bottom-up kinds of ways of prowling the streets where you would find a slightly different kind of China, which might give you a different angle on the all-powerful sort of, global kind of master of the universe, to overstate it. Of course, they're not. But it just struck me that there were other ways of thinking. There are many Chinas, I suppose, is what I thought after researching this book.
And is that what was it? There was, I mean, I suppose you found out a lot of surprising things. Well, are there particular surprises that really blew you away, were totally unexpected?
I think some of the things I found along the Belt and Road in China, because the book ends up by panning out along the Belt and Road, the Middle Passage, which I did travel, though I traveled it from the other direction. And I was surprised at some of the kind of offbeat urban forms. And I wondered, what could you learn about cities by looking at these weird, ghostly, zombie kind of collapsed bits of urbanism rather than the successful high towers? Is there another set of stories there that I could look at? So I was surprised at some of that. I was also surprised actually that both the Greater London Authority and the combined Manchester Authority don't know how much international money is swishing around in their cities. They don't know how much there is, and they don't know where it lands, because that isn't part of planning, as one rather earnest man from the planning office in the at one of the councils explained to me, that's not part of the planning process. We just want to know what's going to be built, and is that okay? Is that going to work? We don't care where the money comes from. And I suppose, I thought perhaps you should care where the money comes from, because in this case, a lot of the money had to go back to China, and we're left with the wreckage of building projects. So
Well,
perhaps you
that's it.
should take an interest.
Yeah, so the key, one of the key elements you look for are holes, don't
Yes.
you? Which is really nice. So, yeah, could you explain a bit about what a hole is, and then maybe, why don't they care about, or do they begin to care about these holes?
Well, they probably do. It's just that the holes hold everything up. So say for example, the Spire hole, which overlooks Canary Wharf. I haven't got the exact dates in front of me, but I think that's been at least 5 years. It's been a hole, right? So this boarded up. There are all these claims on the hoardings around the hole saying it's going to be a landmark building. It's going to have unrivaled views across the city. But actually, it's just a hole. And you think, well, the people that live and work in that area have to tread round that hole. And, that kind of matters in a way. So when these projects collapse, they've then got to find, I don't think the whole developer has collapsed. I think they're still there. They're arguing with Tower Hamlets Council about cost, about social housing, about fire safety, because fire safety has changed in tall buildings since Grenfell. And the fire brigade have quite a big say in what is and isn't safe. So that's kind of ground to a halt around that. And what the Greenland, the developer, are saying is the optics are wrong. We're not going to make any money on this. So we're going to hold on to it. So, that kind of land banking and holding on to holes and so on serves developer interests. I don't think it serves council interests, and it doesn't serve the interests of the council taxpayers of the borough. So I think that's, that is a problem in a way.
And is there a view that something else could have happened there? I suppose maybe the local authorities would say, well, there's no capital coming from anywhere else, and
Mm.
the world economy is not looking great, and Iran, the US have are in a war with, there's a lot of things going on, which would, I
Yes.
suppose, might say, well, who's investing? Who wants to invest at this point anyway?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. And, of course, most city building is done by private interests. So we have to understand that, they need to make profits and so on. But I think the problem with a lot of that money that comes from international or private interests is, well, particularly the Chinese money, but also Kuwaiti money, Saudi money. It comes in the form of iconic buildings. They don't want to build a community center. They don't want to build some social housing, which arguably is what we need. So, the whole is in a sense a missed opportunity to build something that might actually be useful, but nobody really finds sexy enough to put any money into. And I think that is a problem. That is something we need to try and iron out. At the local level, there needs to be some kind of democratic accountability, I would argue, of councils, particularly because we elect them, for what gets built and whether we need more luxury flats in London or whether, the housing shortage points in another direction.
And I suppose today we happen to be talking on the day that Andy Burnham
Yes.
processed in a delayed train to
Was
London.
it delayed? I'm glad it was
Was
delayed.
it was apparently delayed,
Yeah.
and all the press were waiting for him. Um, are there some holes in his reputation that you might have found? I mean, obviously, he was the King of Manchester, the King of the North,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
and overseen this sort of what is sold as a big success of development in Manchester.
Yeah.
Uh, is that quite what it seems from your wanders around Manchester?
Well, no, but both because there's a certain amount of wreckage in Manchester that either hasn't got built very quickly or may eventually. And it's the same story with high-priced housing, except in Manchester, much more it's build to rent. They're trying to profit off generation rent's inability to find deposits to buy places. So, high rents, they'll never ever afford anything. So the Manchester story, yes, it's successful in lots of ways. There's a lot of activity, there's a lot of building. But again, is it the building that Manchester needs? There's still quite a bad housing shortage in Manchester, and much of what's built well, I mean, there is a percentage, of course, that's socially rented and sold as affordable. But affordability, I believe, is 80% of market value. Well, that's the wrong way to look at things anyway, because that's still unaffordable. What other places do, like Singapore and I think Hong Kong in the past, is to look at median income and then try and think about affordability, not market rates anyway. So I think Burnham has, first of all, he hasn't taken responsibility, and the Greater Manchester Authority hasn't taken responsibility for what's being built by foreign capital and whether or not we need it. And, the rate at which it's landing on the landscape. And the other thing is they're really secretive. That in their reports, they talk about Asian money. They don't say Chinese. Well, there's a
These
great.
are the Greater Manchester reports, the authorities' reports.
Yes, they're very coy about this. They don't foreground at all. There's a lot of Chinese funded building in Manchester. It's kind of hidden in plain sight again. No one wants to talk about it. It's not in the reports because it looks under this, sort of Asian badge, which can mean any number of things and probably does. But it's as though, China is a bit of a bogeyman. We don't admit we're taking money from them. So we'll pretend it's coming from maybe could be coming from Hong Kong, Singapore, or one of those nice places. So I think it's dishonest in that it should be plain to everyone where it's coming from and what they're going to do with it. I mean, city making, I know this is in a way, it's unfair to say this about Chinese capital because city making is always a bit secretive like this. We don't really get consulted on what we need. We rely on representatives to do it. If they're doing a change of planning, it's on a lamppost somewhere that no one passes, and you don't get a chance to really engage meaningfully in dialogue with city authorities. But China plays right into that as well, and Chinese money is very much a part of that. So again, you get all these glitzy high-rise buildings with high rents and high purchase prices. And Manchester needs perhaps something different. Although it
Uh,
has been a successful city in many ways, but not on
well,
that.
certainly that's the reputation, isn't it? And it's sort of interesting, I suppose. There is a question at the moment: is Andy Burnham any different, or is there anything he can
Mm.
do? And I suppose that story about Manchester doesn't suggest he's, any different in terms of how he approaches things.
No,
But
I think,
sorry,
sorry. No, I was going to say that the thing about Manchester that shows he might do things differently is the example he keeps giving of the bus garages. I
yeah.
think, rolling back that very neoliberal kind of private sector investment in absolutely everything, water and trains, I think he will try and roll that back. And that might be, that alone, I suppose, might be worth having, because our sort of public services are in desperate state, not least because of the ways in which they're privatized and creamed off for profit for private equity firms like water, so that, everything is rather polluted.
And maybe after that, maybe we could say that housing is an essential service.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly.
So just moving on then to another sort of dimension of the book is the the huge influence of Chinese students for universities across the UK.
Yes.
So how would you say that's affected? Uh, um,
Okay. I think that there are 150,000 or so Chinese students in the UK, and they pay high fees like other international students. And that has allowed, universities to fund themselves in ways when the government grant was kind of falling, really. I mean, the fee structure for home students hasn't really changed much in the last decade. And so it's increasingly impossible for universities to fund themselves. And so, foreign students have been regarded as cash cows, which I think they resent, certainly speaking to Chinese students. They don't like to be thought of in that way. And some of them have encountered a certain amount of hostility while they're here because they're from an authoritarian state and because of all the spying scandals and the bad rap really that China has in our press. And so, I think it's a difficult thing. A lot of the students feel a bit under pressure. They're not sure whether their own government is keeping an eye on them or not. They're stressed by being away from their families. Often they're the products of the one-child family, and they've got elderly relatives with no one to look after them back in China. So there are a number of sort of pressures swirling around these students who are trying to, experiment with living different lives in different places, as young migrants do the world over.
and in terms of the university education system, does that affect what is taught and how things are taught and how things are assessed, I suppose?
It certainly does. I mean, universities don't speak about this, but, and I think this has changed with AI. There are great pressures to allow in international and Chinese students, whatever their qualification base, whatever their grasp of the English language. It used to be, a decade ago when I was involved in recruiting Chinese students, that they had to have a certain IELTS score in order to be allowed in. Well, that's been, it's gone by the by, and they use Google Translate and they use, Duolingo to learn English. And now you don't even have to do that because AI will translate anything for you. And I think, there are courses stuffed full of Chinese students. Universities work out what works and what Chinese students want. And then they expand those courses. And especially in the Russell group, those are the courses most at risk, I think, of closing now because Chinese students, may not necessarily continue to come. They've got a very well-developed education system of their own.
So they won't come because they don't think they're learning, or what I suppose what was the sales pitch of a shiny Western education at a
Mm.
famous university or whatever is no longer what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it works because, I mean, also some of the very smartest students in China can't get into the high prestige universities in Shanghai and Beijing. And so they're left without a place. I mean, competition is massive for places in those elite universities in China. And it's much easier to get into an elite British university. And it's not a bad qualification. I mean, it's a kind of like I always say, it's like buying a Gucci handbag. You've got the label, you went to UCL or LSE or Cambridge or Oxford, and you've got the diploma. And that kind of works. It also, I understand, works when they get back because in order to encourage foreign educated Chinese back to the country, the government gives them certain advantages in hukou, being allowed to live in the big cities, which you wouldn't be allowed to if you didn't have those qualifications, and buying property. So there are some advantages for them in those kind of qualifications. But some of the ones I've spoken to say, they don't say this, but they imply that Britain's good for prestige qualifications, but you wouldn't want to work there. The wages are appalling. And it's not the kind of life you'd want to lead, really. I mean, lots of the business students I spoke to are heading for Dubai and places like that, maybe Australia. They're not that keen on staying in Britain. They find things don't work very well. It's inconvenient, it's crumbling and dirty. It's kind of
So you see the Chinese empire as a bit crumbly on the edges, and they see us as pretty crumbly. Um, then maybe we're partly crumbly due to China. But
yes.
so, I mean, one of the things you're obviously getting in and talking to all sorts of people who most people won't talk to, and finding out sort of thing.
Yeah.
Do you see within Britain, I suppose, that people are beginning to understand more about China, or want to, or or is
No.
this, no one cares?
I don't think so. I think the moment passed, during the period 2008 through till 2016, 17, that kind of golden era. I mean, they were teaching Mandarin in my local secondary school. I mean, there appeared to be, at least on the surface, an interest in things Chinese, the idea that China had a very advanced economy, that perhaps we could steal a march on things by connecting with them, trading with them and using their technology and so on. But I think that moment has really gone. I don't see much interest in China. And one of the guy I called Mr. Back Channel in the book, I don't know if you got to that bit. He thinks, and I can have some sympathy with this view, that we don't much trouble to understand China or what it means. And, it is mostly focused on itself, but also on how it looks to the world. And that even in commercial relationships, we don't take any trouble to learn Chinese or to deal with them in any kind of reasonable way, that it's not something we're sort of interested in doing.
So how's that going to play out, do you think? Because China doesn't look like becoming less powerful anytime soon, and certainly with the recent Iran war, US certainly seems to be less powerful. So if we're not bothering to understand China, may not bode well.
No, I think it will silently spread itself around its networks. The Belt and Roads now goes to, I don't know, 140 countries and territories. In Africa, it's the only money in town. There's no aid money. And of course, that's important. No, I think America's retreat is China's gain. And again, it's a quiet, stealthy kind of influence that's being wielded through, the minutiae of trade deals and technologies and small things that we don't even perhaps notice or know are Chinese. So I think, that is China's gain. And I think that's the kind of global power they want to wield, not the kind of more militaristic, high profile power that America has always wielded. It's different, I think. Though, I'm not a China expert. That's what it seems to be.
I was talking to someone a bit ago about the Belt and Road Initiative, and one of the things they said to me was that um, the Chinese were bringing in people from a lot of the countries to be educated in China, um, and so that I suppose they were trying to create sinophiles. Was that it? A bit, I suppose,
Yeah.
the way the British in their empire brought people
Mm,
from colonies in to be educated here.
yes.
Have you seen, does that ring any bells? Have you seen much of that?
From Britain's point of view, I think that happened quite a lot in the golden era. I mean, I interviewed loads of young Oxbridge educated English kids living in Beijing, learning Chinese, really interested. They said, this is where history is happening. We want to be here. This is the center of the world. And that seems to have gone away after COVID, when most of them actually left because the regulations were absolutely draconian. I don't think people have gone back. But there will be other parts of the world that I don't know about where, that studying or working in China is a great opportunity, perhaps, in developing in the global south, maybe.
And maybe an opportunity for China as well in terms of building its network of people who are sort of on its side or more sympathetic to a Chinese viewpoint and following Chinese rules in the largest sense.
Absolutely. I mean, a lawyer I spoke to in Bulgaria, where China was supposed to be building something and didn't, said that, once you take their money, you implicitly mute your criticism of their treatment of Uyghurs, of their, treatment of Hong Kong, that is somehow not that you can't mention these things, but it's not really done. And they gave me an example of one place where I think I don't know if it's in Bulgaria or somewhere else nearby, but they said, they rounded up all the Uyghurs before the official party came so that, and put them in prison for a couple of days until it was over. And that, you do implicitly accept their authoritarian politics if you take the money, though nobody actually demands that you do. So I think there is that, and the kind of spreading of graft along the Belt and Road as well. I mean, it's not that China creates corruption, but it certainly facilitates what's going on locally by putting in lots of money.
And is this your next book about more in depth about the
The
Belt
Belt
and
and
Road?
Road. Yeah, I've got a longer book about the Belt and Road. I mean, it's covered briefly at the end of this one, but there's some kind of interesting things going on along the Belt and Road that look insignificant, but are kind of interesting, I think.
Brilliant. Well, I'll look forward to
Thank
hearing
you.
more, reading that too, and hopefully we can have a follow up when that's out.
So that would be nice. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting. It's not what I like to do.
Don't worry, it was absolutely fine. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's nice to
Thank you
talk.
very much.